Stephanie Pincetl is a professor at UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. Her work unites urban planning, geography, and social science in order to develop transformative solutions to the climate crisis.
Perfect.
If you only had 1 minute to convince people that climate change was real, what would you say?
Well, climate isn't my first concern.
So you wouldn't...
I think that climate change is really the result of all these other things that we need to think about.
Fire.
We think about climate change and we forget that fossil energy pollutes, right? So if we were to address the fact that fossil energy is contaminating water, soil, our bodies, food, all of these things, that they're poison, maybe we would begin to address the use of fossil energy and there would be less greenhouse gas emissions. We have to start really thinking about what it is that we're using and what the consequences are.
So you've argued that there isn't a magic bullet solution for sustainability.
Mm-mm.
Would you still be psyched if there was?
Well, it would all depend on what it is. There's no free lunch out there. That's an illusion. That's a techno-optimist view that we can find some kind of magic way to get ourselves out of this. There's just not. It's like my leg. I'm not in Star Trek. I sure wish I was. They would zap it and I could just go dancing. But it's not the way the world really works.
So you talked about how fossil fuels supercharge society, and you argue that we need to get off of it and go back to a more normal, kind of sustainable model of life.
Yeah.
But it would seem to me like if fossil fuels are steroids, you're asking a 35-year-old athlete to get off of them but remain at peak performance. But also everybody else in the league isn't going to get off of them, so they're going to keep jacking bombs, and then we're going to be batting below the Mendoza line with no homers and no contract extension. So how can you reasonably ask us to do that when not everybody's going to do it?
Gotta start somewhere.
So be the change you want in the world?
I think so.
Gandhi never made the Hall of Fame in any professional sports league.
Yeah, but people still talk about him.
Not the way people talk about Barry Bonds.
I don't even know who he is.
He's jacked.
I don't know. I don't know.
He's yoked.
I'm sorry. I'm a woman of my age. These are not things that I really...
Straight up brawny.
That's good.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in California. I'm a native Californian. And when I was little, we were in rural San Diego County, which is no longer rural San Diego County.
What happened to rural San Diego County?
It got gobbled up by land developers.
Big machines going out there and
Yeah.
blowing up the terra firma.
Right. So that was really what started me on the path that I am now. And that is, I loved this landscape. That was a Southern California chaparral, and for those of you who've never experienced it, it has this incredible perfume, this incredible odor of sage and all these plants. And as a little kid, we lived right on the edge of that, and you could hear coyotes, and there's a lot of wildlife. And I watched these landscapes being sold, and those gigantic yellow machines that are just bigger than you can possibly imagine, come and tear it all up for suburbs. And because my mother was French and I'd gone to France quite a few times, it was like, well, why do we have to build this kind of dwelling environment, right? There are examples of living in a much more compact way where when you leave the city, there is the countryside, right? You're not just spending all our time transforming resources into money, basically. So it was kind of the beginning of my interest in all these questions about our relationship to nature, about how we live on the planet, how we do things in a more thoughtful and parsimonious way.
Did you like high school?
I detested high school.
Why?
Because I did very poorly with all the peer pressure. And so I was in France in 1968 when the students went out and demonstrated, and all kinds of people demonstrated against the state and wanted to develop a different kind of society, a more flexible society, a society where you it wasn't aimed at just producing goods and being a cog in the machine. And I came back, and it was the middle of the Vietnam War, and I came back, and all my fellow students in France went out on strike. And I came back, and there were these lumps sitting in their chairs who had just no political consciousness whatsoever. And here we were in the middle. We'd just gone through assassinations of Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, all this, the Chicago Convention, the bombing of Cambodia, and they were just like interested in football. And it just, I was a fish out of water.
In an interview you did with Nature Sustainability,
Yeah.
you made the following critique of contemporary science. Clearly, the quantitative turn that occurred in many disciplines in the 1980s has become a dominant mindset, as though numbers that would create generalizable theory could genuinely be developed for everything. This has led to an impoverished intellectual context for asking questions.
Yeah, it's a very profound question, actually, and a fairly complex question. But I think that what has occurred, and I'm certainly not original about this at all, is with the rise of Western science that is really based on the kinds of international explorations that the colonialists made, and the discovery of these different kinds of wildlife and ecosystems and different environments, the way in which those were perceived and understood was through categorizing them and cataloging them. And the idea is that...
Do you think that's dehumanizing?
I think it's denaturizing, right? Because...
So that's bigger than humanizing?
It's bigger than humanizing. It's about looking at nature instrumentally and saying, I can figure out how this is organized and why. And it's a way of distancing oneself from...
It's us trying to dominate nature.
Absolutely. And so numbers are really important in that. So if you can quantify a process and establish a bell curve,
then you feel like you can control it?
You feel like you can control it, and things become commensurable. So, for example, one of the things that is really astonishing is how carbon can be now quantified and made commensurable. So you can plant X number of trees, and that's supposed to mitigate X amount of greenhouse gas emissions from petroleum. But petroleum and trees, burning petroleum and growing a tree, they're very different processes.
Right.
And to think that you can make them all quantifiable under a certain number is a very manipulative and dangerous way to think.
In seeking common ground between theology and sustainability science for just transitions, you criticize the Western idea of scientific objectivity.
Ah.
What do you see as the damaging aspects of this assumption?
What causes damage is that you think you really know, that it's truth. And there are many more kinds of truths out there than what science may tell you.
So what's an alternative truth to science?
Lots of communities, environmental justice communities, are exposed to highly toxic environments, right? Groundwater, soil, air. And there are numbers of examples of you have epidemiological science that takes place, and there are kinds of averages that are used to assess whether the health impacts are related to the source of pollution. And a number of times, the number of miscarriages, for example, will be looked at as not out of the norm. Hence, the poison that the environmental justice community has pointed out is causing these harms is not a problem, right? And so there's a different kind of knowledge and lived experience that is not less true than the epidemiological scientific study. That's a good example for you.
Do you think golfing should be illegal?
Yes, I do. How'd you know? No, I don't think it should be illegal. I think it should be made to internalize the costs that it incurs on society.
So some kind of tax.
Well, I think that in LA we have public golf courses, and we have a park shortage. Who should have the access to that space? Should there be more parks, or there should be people driving around in golf carts with their clubs. And they require a lot of water and pesticides and herbicides. So it's how do you add these things up? What's the ledger look like?
Land use is a dominant topic in your work. An enormous swath of human history can be attributed to the desire to possess land and extract its resources.
I disagree with that premise. Sorry.
You don't think that's a big part of human history? Well, you must not disagree with the desire to possess land as being a huge part of human history. That seems to be all of human history.
Why do you think that?
Well, at least recorded history, it seems like there's always been dominant nations that were trying to expand their borders. Whether it be the Roman Empire, Genghis Khan, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the United States Empire to a degree.
When did all those appear?
I don't know, like 10,000 BC. So I guess since Homo sapiens have understood how to network across distant lands.
I think there are plenty of counterexamples. Lots.
For sure.
And that it satisfies.
I'm sure there's.
It satisfies our idea that possessing private property is normal. Many, many cultures across the world historically have had common lands that they managed together. But because it suits capitalism to have private property, it's become normalized that we should wish to have our own individual property and manage it the way we want. Right?
So I guess I would ask you then, like, what's a large population version of what you're talking about?
So I would say that in the United States, there were there were thousands of tribes, right? And that they had strategies and agreements about land management. There was no land ownership, which was one of the big problems, because when the Westerners came, because there were no inscribed property rights, because they were shared properties, they felt legitimized to possess the properties because nobody owned them. I'll give you a very recent and kind of amazing example. So my husband and I have a 20-acre orange grove in Ojai, which is 90 miles north of LA, inland valley about 15 miles from the coast. Very prime citrus growing valley, traditionally. And there was and it was Chumash land. It was tribal land. And there was an individual who said, well, they had no land treaties, they had no land rights because they didn't have any written land ownership, proof of land ownership. And you have to wonder, well, how is that possible that you don't recognize that people lived here for at least 10,000 years, and because they don't have a written property deed, it doesn't belong to them. But there were lots of ways in which that land was managed through consensus and discussion.
What did that look like?
So there's a really nice example of that in Northern California, and all the rivers that empty out to the ocean, particularly in Northern California. They were salmon runs on those rivers, right? Different kinds of salmon at different periods at salmon breeding time. And so all along the river, they had agreements about how much salmon could be extracted by any one of the tribes in order to ensure that the tribe at the headwater still got some salmon, and that there was enough salmon left in the river
for next year.
That's done by observation, by trial and error, and by discussion. And it doesn't mean that the discussion is always agreeable. I'm sure that there were lots of arguments along the way, but they did manage those resources, what we would call today, sustainably. There are counterexamples as well, but by and large, they're called common property resources, were managed intelligently by people. They understood what the carrying capacity of that place was relative to their needs, and they would extract what they needed and not more.
Do you think it's hypocritical that you live on 20 acres of land?
I don't live on it. I actually grow oranges.
On a community land?
Well, no, this is private property.
Oh, so do you think it's hypocritical that you own 20 acres of land?
I think that in this contemporary society, there's no other way for me to have the land.
Is it unethical to have kids?
No.
even if it's like a suck on the resources that perpetuate climate change?
I think that the problem is that the top 10% use way too much of everything.
And what about the middle 30?
They are not exempt, but they are not really the biggest problem.
So you think if rich people stopped flying so much, stopped having their AC on, stopped buying so many cars?
And we're really heavily taxed.
For that use?
For that use, and just that, what do people need all that money for?
So
They're not going to die with it.
What do you think the tax rate should be for the rich?
Well, under Eisenhower, you probably know this, it was 90%.
Right, but wasn't there a lot of inefficiencies in the IRS, so they paid the exact same in taxes yearly?
Yeah, under Eisenhower?
I've read that before.
Oh, that I have not read.
Yeah.
You could be right. I don't know. But I think that the principle is correct. We do not have actual competitive capitalism today. We have monopoly capitalism with, like Google and Microsoft and Amazon.
It does bum me out.
And the owners of those companies, including the shareholders, have so much money that they don't contribute to the public good, and yet the public good is really important for them to actually survive.
And you've talked about this a lot. Like in a lot of your teachings, you say there is no magic bullet that's going to come along technologically that's going to create sustainability or prevent us from having to change our habits. But I worry it's impossible to scale that, to make people change their habits en masse to protect the earth.
Well, okay, so here's the one thing. Change is ubiquitous all the time. So the question is, what kind of change is it going to be? I mean, when I grew up, I didn't have an iPhone, right? And I had an okay life, right? We had to fight for that landline, but it was basically okay. And so I think it's partly about what is enough to live a good life. And that's not a question that we actually pose very much. We do know that people are pretty disaffected from capitalism. Consumption is not terribly satisfying, that there is a kind of sense of unease in terms of the way people live their lives. But what there's not is really a pathway that is well articulated and that enables people to realize that they can live a fulfilled life.
Do you have any kind of version of that you could articulate?
Well, I think that so there are numbers of aspects of that. So as far as economic growth, which everybody thinks we talk about as a normal thing for the world, the Japanese have not had economic growth. And in Japan, people live pretty decent lives, right? They're not, there's lots of problems in Japan, no question about it. Gender relations, hierarchy, rigidity, you name it, there's lots of problems. But the fact of the matter is, they have pretty high technologies and, relatively lower energy consumption, relatively lower consumption per capita, and, it's a functioning place.
But isn't one of the issues there that no one's having kids?
Well, is that a bad thing? You just asked me about having kids as being...
Which is why I think it's interesting you picked Japan, because that's like one place where they're actually diminishing in population.
Yeah, because it just doesn't seem... having kids is a really... It needs a lot of infrastructure to have kids. We're not going to run out of people. We may run out of consumers, enough consumers to keep the growth machine going. That's a different question. The reason why we're all of a sudden panicked that population numbers are declining in China and they're in Europe and now here is because the capitalist machine needs continued growth. So if you have less people, you have less consumers. Well, that's maybe a pathway to a more sustainable future.
I don't know if that's why people are bummed out about it. That's certainly not why I'm bummed out about it.
Why are you bummed out about it?
Because I do think it's kind of built into our hard wiring to perpetuate our species. And the idea that people aren't doing that feels like some kind of spiritual ennui. Yeah, or nihilism.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd call it nihilism. I'd call it like sadness.
I can't expect people to be responsible for perpetuating the species. That's, why?
Yeah, I guess I just think it's natural.
Oh, well, what is natural? Natural is really socially contingent.
Yeah, that's like in *Sapiens*, right? He says everything's natural. If it happens, it means it's natural.
Yeah, well, he's an ass, but that's another story.
Whoa. What do you think?
Well, he just is so Eurocentric in the way he looks at stuff. It's very narrow.
What's an example of him being Eurocentric?
Well, what you just, naturalizing everything. Well, then, how do you, I think that cultural values are culturally specific. And I'm not in a position to say this is natural or not natural. I'm in a position to look at, how it is that culture gets organized and then what is seen as natural. So, one of the, there's this whole thing about seeing, say, fossil energy that we're burning as kin, those animals that
like part of some life process to use them.
Well, that's not something that normally is thought of in our culture. But for other cultures, like indigenous cultures, they might actually see all the natural world as kin, not as other. And we don't. So is that natural or is it socially contingent?
What is degrowth?
So degrowth is a term that I think has been maybe not a very good term, is how I would put it. So degrowth is about understanding that economic systems, just like everything else, can't continue to grow forever. It doesn't. It's nonsensical to think that your economy can continue to grow, because what does that mean? What does that mean? Is it just generating more money and producing more stuff? I mean, so what does that lead you to, right? It doesn't lead you to anything that has any kind of quality or meaning for people's daily lives, right? You're just producing stuff for more stuff's sake and more money. So what degrowth is really, I think, trying to say is that economies have to be re-embedded in society, that economies are about meeting people's needs, right? It's not about surplus stuff for other, and that for some people, like the top 10%, you're going to just have a lot less stuff. You're not going to be able, Taylor Swift will not be able to fly on her whatever Learjet or something all over the world. And
you don't think she deserves that?
I don't think anybody deserves that.
Even though people want to see her so bad and she gives so much to so many people?
Well, she could just take a boat. She could take a train. She'd still get there.
But she would get there more slowly.
Oh, sure. What's wrong with that?
Not as many people would see her.
What's wrong with that?
I think it means a lot to people to see her.
Well, she has a long life ahead of her. She can just do it slowly. But going back to degrowth, let's go back to degrowth. Degrowth is more like steady state economics. And that is to say, the economy is not oriented around growth. It's oriented around producing the kinds of goods that people need for their daily lives. So food, shelter, healthcare, things like that. And so in some places that means you're living with somewhat less, and other places you live with a bit more.
Capitalists like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos propose a view of humanity in a state of perpetual growth, colonizing land outward forever in conjunction with the advance of our technological abilities until we're mining asteroids for precious materials and living in permanent colonies on Mars.
Yep.
In your work, you've advocated for the imagination of alternative utopias. Can you describe one such utopia now?
That exists today?
No, describe what your future utopia
my
would be.
future utopia is?
Paint up an alternative
right.
picture to what they're sending.
You have time on your hands. You can take naps. You can screw around with your kids. You can walk down the street and buy a gallon of milk. You have meaningful work that you enjoy, that creates something that is a attribute of society. Doesn't mean it contributes to economic growth, but you could be a nurse's aide. You could be somebody who takes care of all those street trees.
If you're going to best Bezos and Musk when they're thinking that hyperbolic, I think you've got to have something equally...
No, I don't agree. I think people are tired of all that shit. Why would we do that? Going and living on a space colony is like, it's like it would be awful, actually.
You think so?
You have to deal with your urine and your shit, and you have to eat terrible food. I mean, I think that the fantasy, it's a modernist fantasy that is tired today. There are way more fun and interesting things to do than to live on a space colony and to run machines to bring back whatever it is. I think people are ready for something that is more human.
On your website, you include a haiku that you wrote that was inspired by a trip to Ojai.
Yeah.
How does poetry inform your work?
There's so much to be grasped through the poetic expression, particularly the haiku, that is succinct and crisp and just is very evocative.
Do you believe in God?
No.
Have you ever had a profound spiritual experience in nature?
Oh yeah.
Were you on mushrooms?
Yeah.
That's sick, dude. I could tell by the way you said yeah.
Mm-hmm.